Thanks for joining us this evening for another cross-continent webinar. Ken, how are you? You're going to say hi?
Hey, everyone. Great to see you again.
Ken, we're just starting, so I'm happy to let you make an introduction and say hi, then I'll put you off camera and I'll go, but thanks for coming on.
Okay,
Let me just see how many people.
Start
okay.
now.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? So welcome everyone to this evening's YANA program called COVID-19, Turning Pain into Purpose. We're delighted to bring back with us two young alumni from Yale who started their own organizations at the beginning of the pandemic. They've had lots of personal journeys, organizational journeys, and just really blessed to have them doing the work that they're doing, and then to come back and share their stories, what they've learned, and obviously take some questions from the audience. So we're very proud to have them as part of the YANA and the Yale community, and I hope you'll ask some good questions, and we're looking forward to this conversation. Before we get started, Ken Inadomi, our founder and chair, is on here. Ken's the one who originally brought Kristin and Liam, and now here we are 2 years later. So Ken, please, a few words.
Just a few words. And again, to Liam and to Kristin, thank you, congratulations, just a hat tip to both of you. I like to tell people that you took a moment and created a movement out of that. And it was 2 years ago when all of us were just dumbfounded at world events, and you kept your cool, you stayed courageous, you stayed focused. And again, you created programs and organizations that now have literally a national reputation. So can't wait to hear 2 years later how things have developed, what's on your minds, and what you look forward to in the future. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ken. All right, Ken, I'm going to put you off screen.
Good to see you.
Ken, if you stop your video, and then I can figure out some way to remove that. I'll get into that in a second. All right, let's go to the questions. So Kristin, I want to start with you. You graduated from Yale in class of 2003. Let's actually start even like before you got to the pandemic. What did you do right after college? And let's start with that right away. 2003. I don't even remember what the world was like back then.
Yeah, no, my time at Yale completely transformed the trajectory of what I thought I was going to do. I knew going into college that I wanted to help people. I recently just reconnected with my Yale application and read my personal story was about wanting to be a good ancestor to like my Latino community. And this was like late 90s before people were using that type of like buzz language. So, but over the course of my time at Yale, I became very politically active. And we were just 9/11 happened. I was with Yalies in London when 9/11 happened. You know, the war in Afghanistan broke out. I decided that instead of helping people in the context of becoming a doctor, I wanted to become politically active. So I started working on environmental causes in Midwestern states and places all across the country to protect clean water, clean air, and really started to develop a career in what became environmental justice issues, both US as well as internationally.
And so where were you for, let's say, how many years? It's quite a while, I guess.
I know, I'm approaching
2020
year reunion. I physically live now in San Francisco, and I had most recently been working for about a decade under an environmental organization that works to transform the global food system to not only prevent deforestation, displacement of indigenous peoples, prevent pandemics, but also to provide, public health, be able to bring sort of food back into people's lives in a way that gave them agency and control and kind of solve some of these systemic inequities that we see with our food system. So I, physically was in California, close to my parents in Arizona, feeling really good about my career, the direction I was headed in, feeling really good about being number 2 at a growing and large organization who was also headed by a Yalie, and had just finished a mid-career graduate program where I went to UC Berkeley to focus in on how to develop equitable policy, because I had noticed throughout the course of my career, both from the things that I was drawn to, but also my lived experience, that getting to the root cause of like, how do we actually create policy and create worlds and create a system in which there are more equitable outcomes during crises, was something that just kept reappearing in all of my work. And so I decided to go back to go to grad school and really study that. And that program I wrapped up actually a month before, in May of 2020, a month before my own personal COVID story started.
Okay, let's pause there and then let's go to you, Liam, because you were started in college, right? You haven't been out of college quite as long. So let's get your quick background story. It could be very complex. I didn't mean number of years to be any minimize the amount of experience you've had. So where were you at Yale? What time? And this is just a couple of years ago. What were you majoring in? What were you thinking of doing?
Yeah, and I still haven't walked. I'm walking this May, so I feel like you guys are being very generous by calling me an alum and letting me speak tonight. It's great to be here, and thank you for what you said, Kristin. I think a lot about legacy also, and it's that seems to be a common point that I see among a lot of people who are involved in this kind of work, is wanting to make sure that the work we do, matters even once we're gone. And that's something I hear a lot from people in the mutual aid sector to philanthropy, that when we depart from this earth, we want it to matter that we were ever here, right? And we want it to pass on that legacy and that lineage, and that work. So when COVID hit, I was a junior on spring break. I had just come back to New York, my hometown, from a voter registration trip in Philly. And, I remember we'd been hosted by all these amazing hosts who were like in their 80s and loved the idea of having college students like stay at their homes and go out and register voters. But I remember, things were getting scary. We would, wash our hands very diligently every time we came home. And it felt weird to be like going out, meeting all these strangers, and then coming back to the homes of these elderly people and potentially infecting them. And I talked to one of our hosts and she said, everything's a risk, but this is a risk worth taking because this work matters. And then when, the pandemic worsened and we all locked down, there I was sitting in my apartment with nothing to do but be home, stay at home, be a hero, and, watching reruns of Breaking Bad. And that didn't feel particularly heroic to me. And meanwhile, there were so many people, particularly elderly people who were, or immunocompromised people with disabilities, people who were sick at the time, who couldn't go out and get their necessities, get their medicine, get their food. And the policy response felt woefully inadequate to me, that we were just going to tell a bunch of people to stay home and hope that would work. And so I felt like, as someone who's young and can go out and shop at relatively low risk, it's incumbent upon me in this moment of crisis to do what I can for my neighbors and for my community. And so we can talk more about this.
Yeah, keep going. Go ahead.
Okay, cool.
We'll go back to Kristin. So go ahead.
I was majoring, to answer your question about my major,
yeah.
I was majoring in EP&E, ethics, politics, and economics, with the goal of bringing more ethics to our politics and our economics. And I think that starts by this kind of community organizing, right? There are tons of problems in our policy realm and our economic realm, but I think it starts with grassroots community organization. Change doesn't come from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. And so the opportunity to organize my friends and to make new friends and people to meet people who wanted to do a good thing in a time that felt so bad, felt really exciting to me. So I looped up with a friend, Simone Policano, who's class of 2016. She was an American Studies major, for those of you wondering. And we decided we were going to create a website and recruit some volunteers to go out shopping and deliver to people who were stuck at home. So we threw up a website on Squarespace, put out a call to action on social media, posted some flyers around, thought we'd, recruit a couple dozen volunteers, do some deliveries over my spring break, go back and, finish college. And 3 days later, we had 1,300 volunteers signed up. And we were like, oh my God, okay, there's really an interest in this and there's really a need as well. And so we decided to really operationalize it, to take in donations, to hire a staff, to build out an operational base, to approach philanthropy, to grow this organization, this volunteer, as you said, movement of people who wanted to be engaged in service in a time when we all had some additional time on our hands, but we also had an additional determination to help out those in our own community. And so we've since expanded that mission beyond just delivering to the homebound to really focus on addressing this longer term crisis of food insecurity, because 3/4 of people who experience food insecurity don't go to a pantry because of logistical challenges or scheduling issues or social stigma. And so what we're able to do with our volunteer service is provide a safe and efficient and anonymous alternative for people so that we can prioritize their safety and their dignity and their valuable time.
I love the fact that you both were already on this path to kind of thinking about policies and equity and how things could be done better. And then you actually had an opportunity to apply that. So I want to come back to you, Liam, but Kristin, let's get back to you. When COVID hit, what happened?
Well, I started thinking about COVID pretty early on. I remember coming back from a service trip that I was doing with my grad program to Kenya, and I was on a layover in Switzerland at the same time that Air Force One was refueling on their way to Davos. And it was at that meeting in Davos that then President Trump assured the press that the US was, quote, totally under control when it came to COVID. And I can remember thinking about that term, oh, everything's fine, it's totally under control. And having this like alarm bells go off in my head, thinking like, if it wasn't actually totally under control, this was going to be really bad. And in particular, bad for people already living on the margins of society. And while I never have, studied disaster studies, I know from my equity work that disasters punch down. And, fast forward 5 months later, the zip code I grew up in, where my parents still live, where my mom still lives, 85035, where Yale picked me up. It was not only the worst place in the state of Arizona for COVID, it was the worst place in the entire world for COVID. And my neighborhood, unsurprisingly, is mostly immigrant, mostly Latino. We saw the entire healthcare system broken, not just from afar, but from my front door. And it really, and meanwhile, the state of Arizona was implementing a crisis standard of care, basically triaging who they could and couldn't take into emergency rooms. Well, the governor had promised, seeing what had happened in New York, that we would only reopen when ready, that if we had a surge, we would have the supplies, workforce, everything in place to be able to manage. And we didn't. And today actually marks 20 months since my dad died from COVID-19 from that surge.
So you're excited, yeah.
He was 65. He was in his prime. He contracted COVID and died a painful, undignified, lonely death. And it took 19 days between his first cough to his last breath. And those 19 days fundamentally changed me. They broke me in a way that I never knew I could be broken. I account it to torture. I have moments of remembering, feeling gratitude that I had never actually known what agony had felt like before. But agony is, the person that you love being in a hospital, that you can't reach them for hours on end, never being able to talk to their doctor, not knowing if they're getting care, knowing that their hospital is at 200% capacity, learning 10 hours after they've been put on a ventilator that they've been put on a ventilator. The list goes on and on and on. And when he ended up passing, I couldn't stop looking away, not only from my own recent lived experience, but what was happening around me in what Dr. Stephen Thrasher now calls the viral underclass, and how it was people in my community that got hit first, got hit hardest, that were literally dying. And nobody was talking about it. The data was already there, confirming that people of color, Black folks, Native folks, Latinx folks were getting sick and dying at at rates that were unheard of and continue to be the case even to this day. And I remember kind of seeing my emotions. I felt like I had a Category 5 hurricane deposited in my body. I figuratively and literally saw red. I thought I could push over buildings with the rage that I had, that if I were to open my mouth, that fire would come out. Recognizing that in me scared me. And I saw it in the people around me who loved my father, about how much they felt that he was robbed, that we were lied to, and that this should not have been happening to him nor our community. And I kept on thinking to myself, where is it? Why isn't somebody saying something? Why aren't, like, we all just wrote these DEIJ statements standing up against inequities because of the brutal murder of George Floyd. Where are we right now on COVID when literally people are dying, the same people? And it became apparent, those things that we hear in activist movements, never doubt a small group of people can change the world. If not me, who? If not now, when? Those came flooding to me, and my partner Kristin and I sort of looked at one another and realized it's us. We've got to share our story. So that's how that's what started us along the Marked by COVID journey.
And what was the intention of starting this organization? What was the mission of it? Because we talk about nonprofits. You decided to do something. Why this particular route, and how did you envision it going forward?
We envisioned it being a nonprofit that would help families who had lost loved ones share their stories, to both have both be able to provide support and kind of care and sort of legitimacy and trauma support that way, but really as an avenue to help provide, like, put a face to this pandemic, as the AIDS quilt did for the AIDS movement. So that these were not just numbers, these were people whose lives mattered, who leave behind just an incredible wealth of impact, and whose absence will be felt for generations to come. And so our mission was to help those families share their stories, but then also work with those families to turn them into activists, to turn them into, to help them become organizers and develop their leadership skills to push for better policies within their local jurisdictions, their state jurisdictions, and on the federal level for the pandemic response.
And then how did you actually start it? I mean, you just did you share it by word of mouth, say, hey, I want to start doing this, create a website, start posting your stories? Like, what did you actually do to kind of move this thing into some kind of existence?
I'll say that I would not have been able to do this without the privilege that I do have. Coming from the environmental nonprofit space, I knew some of the back end of how to set up an organization. My partner is a communications expert in the nonprofit world with a background in AIDS, HIV communications. And so we sort of also looked at each other and were like, we have sort of like the basic skills to be able to do something. And so we set out, we literally wrote a list. Like, we need to figure out a name. We need to buy all the URLs. We need to get all the social media handles. And we need to also reach out to people we trust in our community and give them an opportunity to volunteer to help get the trains running on time. And so I, did a set of calls to folks that I'd worked with, friends from high school, people from college, and said, this has happened. This is what we're going to do. And here's some of the roles in which we need filled. Can you volunteer 10 hours and help sift through hundreds of messages from folks who've just lost a loved one? Can you literally sort of just breaking it down? Yeah. Help us do this, community source this, this resource. And then on the back end, we're doing everything that we could to kind of manage and sustain the organization, but I was actively grieving as well. And we can talk more about this later in how, I probably would have done some things differently, and, but also recognize that there was some sort of superhuman adrenaline and just pure love that was driving me. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about, of like, how do we work sustainably with impacted people to help them share their stories in a way that is not extractive, but actually really helps to build more leaders.
Okay, and we're going to come back to that, definitely, kind of what you've learned and things. So Liam, let's get back to, I mean, you sort of had this idea, you were seeing it would happen, you're like, wait a minute, we can do X. And you also really relied on these. How did you actually kind of get this thing started? And when did you decide, like, did you call people, you're like, oh, let's make this a nonprofit, let's make it, like, how did that process work for you on the kind of parallel side, starting from where you did?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Kristin, I want to say thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, definitely.
You know, that exemplifies, you know, turning pain into purpose, right? What you shared. And it's one of the hardest things to do and one of the most powerful things to do. So I thank you for sharing your story and for the work that you're doing. In terms of, you know, did I want to start a nonprofit? No, not at all. You know, the nonprofit sector was something I knew quite literally zero about, other than it was not for profit and donations were something with taxes. That was about all I knew. I wanted to start a group to, you know, to bring food to people. And I had done similar stuff in college, you know, starting a group to, you know, register student voters and stuff like that. Like, that was kind of how I was imagining it was a thing. And if people needed to be reimbursed, I'd like pay them over Venmo, kind of thing, super chill. And then once we started getting all this money and it was going into my co-founder Simone's bank account, a lawyer said, hey, that's going to be taxable income, by the way. And she was like, oh, no, absolutely not. I do not want to pay taxes on these thousands of dollars that are coming in. And so that was when the lawyer said, okay, let's set you up as a nonprofit. You can get more money that way, and started explaining how it actually worked. But, you know, given the amount of donations that were coming in, you know, we decided to go with a fiscal.
Hey, how did you start getting donations? Like, how did people know what you were doing? Did people just say, hey, you know, I heard you're doing this, do you guys need money? And it's like, how did that work?
Yeah, so the initial outreach was really, you know, it's tough because we were trying to reach three very different audiences. The first audience we were trying to reach was obviously the people we're trying to serve, right? Who tended to be elderly, harder to reach via social media. So you have to do more, you know, standard paper campaigns, you know, flyering around the community. But even that's tough because hopefully they're staying home. So you have to reach people in their homes. So you have to go on the news. So we did a lot of local media outreach, trying to get into local papers that had a wide readership, particularly among the elderly. And then you also had our volunteers, right, who did tend to be more social media friendly. And so we had to do a social media campaign to reach those folks. And then there was the donors who were kind of in that in-between area, and tends to spread more via word of mouth. And so in terms of, you know, how we reach people on a national scope, it was from local papers, because that's where a lot of national media gets their stories from, is from local papers. And so we were in a hyper-local newspaper called the West Side Rag, and then the wife of an NBC producer happened to be reading about us, and the NBC producer was saying, oh my God, I'm scheduling this entire 90-minute segment about how terrible COVID is. I need like a 3-minute segment at the end about like good people doing some good in the world. And she was like, oh, I'm literally reading the story about these 3 kids in college, you know, 3 20-somethings doing good work. And so he contacted us, and then boom, we were on Lester Holt. And then from there, it was Good Morning America and Fox and Friends. And so that kind of media broadcast helped us spread the word a lot to all the segments of our audience that we were trying to reach. Now, obviously, that's kind of a lightning strike thing that's not very actionable for, you know, anyone, including me. Certainly was not something I would expect, and certainly is not something I'll be able to duplicate. So I think, you know, broadly speaking, a strategy for recruitment includes, you know, reaching out to community stakeholders, knowing who your audience is and who can reach those audiences. You know, does someone have a newsletter that reaches a lot of the people you're trying to reach? Does someone have a local newspaper or a podcast? Can you promote on social media effectively if those are the kinds of people you're trying to reach? And so as the media attention has simmered down, we're trying to keep up interest and recruit new people through those other strategies.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get a little bit. It's like, what do we do now to the sort of succession planning and stuff? I want to pick up some things that Kristin talked about. You obviously don't have the same kind of emotional connection to the topic, but you were, not to minimize it, but you were sort of, you saw it, you were around it. What were some of the, I don't know, what were you witnessing with people? Like with the, what were the emotions of people you were trying to serve? Or was it just sort of like, oh, here's a practical need to do this? Or were you sort of picking up something deeper and more universal that you were seeing just a little piece of that were amplified by the COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, I was naive when I started it. I was thinking this will be a great thing to do. I could sense the positivity in it all, but I couldn't quite sense the depth of the need and how meaningful it would be. And that was something I really got a sense from quite quickly, particularly from people who had not had a friend to talk to in a long time. We got outreach from a woman who lived in Michigan, and her dad was in his 80s. He lived in New York. He'd been diagnosed with COVID, and he had no way of getting help. He lived alone, and his own daughter couldn't get to him because of the lockdowns. And so he didn't know what to do. He didn't want to go to the store and get other people sick. She heard about us. She submitted a request on our website, and our volunteer would go to his door every week, drop off food, drop off medicine, and address that emotional hunger of social isolation. And she said, they'd sit on either side of his door and they would just talk about their lives and their fears and their joys. And she said they never saw each other. They wouldn't have recognized each other if they passed on the street, but they became friends. And
that's beautiful.
And he passed away from COVID.
Oh, so sorry.
But his daughter said, that that the friendship and the kindness that this complete stranger showed him in his last days meant the world to their entire family at a time when she couldn't even be there. And so that kind of spirit of service and connectedness that recipients are getting, that volunteers are getting, I think speaks to our larger and broader humanity.
And I want, before I go back to Kristin, because I want to pick up on, like, both of you guys have talked about, using these, volunteers being driven by something you've seen. You've already started in kind of what you know. I mean, Kristin, you were well into it. You're developing your career in the nonprofit. Liam, you're still like, oh, I'm going to do grassroots, and then here's a chance to kind of implement it. I wasn't planning on doing this, but let's get to a little bit of like, what were some of the policy failures? I mean, sometimes we talk about how nonprofits and things fill in the gaps where private sector or government aren't doing enough. So I don't know if you've had a chance to reflect about this. I mean, what were you seeing? What did you learn about food insecurity policies, whatever the COVID policy was? I don't know, housing, social, how people were living. I mean, what were some of the sort of the things that might have related to the way we've sort of set up our society in this country? What you were saying on on the level right there in New York, but clearly had national repercussions and international.
Well, I remember, maybe a week and a half after starting this organization, it was 3 a.m. and my phone starts buzzing, and I pick up the phone and I say, this is Liam. And she said, hi, is this Invisible Hands? And I said, yeah. And she said, hi, I'm in Dallas, Texas, and I'm wondering if you can help me out. And I was like, oh, sorry, we only serve New York. And she said, oh, Bernie Sanders said that you could help me. I was like, sorry, what now? And then my phone just started buzzing nonstop, because what had happened was I had stupidly put my personal phone number on the flyer for Invisible Hands, and then Blake Lively had put it on her Instagram, and then it had been in Elle magazine. And then Bernie Sanders had emailed out my personal phone number to his entire email list and said, call this number if you need free food. Didn't specify, just
what it was, who it was.
Right. And so, suddenly I'm getting all of these calls. If you called the New York City hotline for the first 2 months of the pandemic and said, I need food, New York City government would say, we can't help you, hang up and call Invisible Hands, which was my personal phone. Like, our social safety net should not be dependent on a 20-year-old remembering to pick up his phone. That's a bonkers way to run a society. And so Invisible Hands was a really powerful reminder of the importance of community organizing and the necessity for grassroots communication. But it was also a really striking reminder of the profound failure of our bureaucratic inefficiencies. And there was a line in a New Yorker piece about this very issue that said, sometimes we can get so, we can become so moved by stories of people coming together to survive hardship that we forget that those hardships shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah.
And so while I was really grateful that we got media attention and that we got volunteers and that we had financial support and that we were able to help people, I'm also really mindful of the fact that we shouldn't let these kinds of stories excuse the fact that these issues exist in the first place. And so, and we can talk about, my future.
Yeah, I mean, I always love to say, like, with a nonprofit, what would it take to put you out of business? And a lot of it has to do with kind of the policy. Like you see, like the reason why people around the world are calling me is because the Department of Housing and Food or whatever it is in New York City, why don't they have it? Why weren't they set up to handle this?
I think, there's something to be said for the fact that governments are large and inefficient bureaucracies. And so when there's an immediate crisis, you do need grassroots organizing to quickly respond to it. And I think even, the best set up government in the world would struggle in a global pandemic to deliver services effectively. But at the same time, I think that, if you look at the companies that ended up taking, for instance, COVID relief money, it ended up being a lot of companies that did not need COVID relief money. Yeah. And I think often our government is responsive, but not to the people that they should be responsive to. Right. And I think that speaks to broader issues in terms of our strength as a democracy, that our government is not nearly as responsive as a community organization can be, but a community-based organization cannot scale those efforts in the way that government can. And so
that's exactly right. And I think one thing I would add into that piece is that the pandemic really exposed for all of us to see just the system and how it works, and that it works for a much smaller subset than the American public. And something that was very much central in us starting Marked by COVID was to leverage storytelling as a mechanism for helping to really drill down what those policy failures are, those millions, those billions of policy failures. Like our, first activist, YANA, whose hospital did not have proper PPE. Going backwards, there wasn't adequate funding for her hospital, so she had to reuse the 3 same masks over and over again until she got COVID and died 4 days later. But we're also seeing that that's just one tiny micro piece of just how the system is not working for the vast majority of people. And I think that COVID has given us an opportunity to think about this as like a tech solution of like, this is a disruptor. We have an opportunity to actually build back in a way that's more resilient, more in line with our core values of equality, equity, opportunity for all. But the system we're living in right now, it is not prepared to handle the crises of tomorrow, let alone today. And I think a lot about the climate crisis, as well as other things that we're facing. And we've got to use this moment to fix these systems.
What were some of the policy, failures, these individual stories, but what were the systems that weren't working, that were allowing the most, as you said, people on the margins to be hit hardest and fast? And then not only they're getting sick, but then the support systems that are supposed to be there aren't working, and then the caregivers aren't getting sick. And so what were some of the major things? I mean, I love that brilliant idea. You're like passing from your way back from Africa, and Air Force One is on its way to Davos, and it's the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, that just a very stark and interesting contrast. But so talk about a little bit some of these policies and in maybe some concrete ways. Specifically.
I think the thing that first and foremost, really put us in a bad position was the downplaying of the pandemic from day one, saying that it wasn't a big deal, that it wasn't something that we had to look to worry about. And then the cascade of sort of things that came from that. We never had from day one a national coordinated data informed response. Pushing this down on a state by state level for something that is transmissible through the air is just not a way to be able to manage a pandemic. And we all know that we have a pandemic playbook. Scientists across the country, friends of mine, were freaking out in January with the steps that we were already taking. And instead, we decided as a country to pretend like this wasn't a big deal to begin with. And then when states like Arizona started to reopen, our governor instated policies that prevented local municipalities from taking any additional safety measures. So the time my dad got sick, his mayor, the city of Phoenix, was pleading for the ability to enforce a mask mandate, as well as controls on how many people are in a building, to which there was no, their hands were tied to do so. And so we just really let this get out of control from day one, which eroded confidence in the public in our response and has kind of created this terrible situation that we're currently in. And so I think it's both a policy issue, but it's also a leadership issue. And when we are in a time of crisis, we are trained to turn to the people in charge to tell us what to do to stay safe. That's what the Army does. That's like what we are supposed to do. And people like my dad, you know, whenever the state reopened and the governor said it was safe, he believed them. And he had no reason not to believe him.
Yeah, no, there's so much could be said about a lot of this, and we could have a whole other discussion of some of these breakdowns in leadership and sort of the federalist way our government is set up and local versus, federal, things like that. But given the time we have, and also trying to think about, our audience who's going to, so you can see some questions coming in are pretty practical. So if you can see questions about competition, what rapid growth, sustainability. So let's talk okay, here we are now in 2022. What was Liam, back to you, okay, those are amazing stories about how this thing picked up so quickly, your personal phone number, what's happened over these past 2 years, kind of organizationally? I think we've got a pretty good sense of what you've learned and thinking about, but what's happened? How's it grown? Who's got involved in it now? And where is it in visible hands today?
Yeah. And thank you, Ralph, for the question about, sustainability, because part of the difficulty with the nonprofit sector is it is not a sustainable thing, just kind of baked into that, right? There's a lot of dependence on philanthropy, and there are ways to build in funding into the programmatic model, to charge for your services. It's difficult when you're trying to serve people who don't have a lot of money to be able to pay for those services. And so in terms of sustainability, even as COVID ebbs, as Kristin has said, the profound racial and economic inequities left in its wake are going to continue to pervade our society for a long, long time. What we are best set up to do is to address that longer term crisis of food insecurity. We've had people who used to call asking for grocery deliveries, who now call asking for pantry deliveries, because they say, now I can't even afford my own food. And they've fallen further into that pit of economic despair. And so what we do is we partner with food pantries. Someone will call us, they'll say we can't afford our own food. We will find a pantry or mutual aid group or church or synagogue or something in their area that fits their dietary needs, their scheduling needs, et cetera. And we will dispatch a volunteer to go pick it up and deliver it. We'll also work directly with those pantries to dispatch a volunteer with a car who can pick up 5 to 8 boxes of food and go house by house by house, dropping it off, establishing those social connections along the way. One of the things that I've learned in terms of sustainability of volunteerism, of recipient loyalty, of donor interest, is make sure that people are building relationships, not only with you as the founder, but with other people within the organization, with other volunteers, with other recipients. We've had people who are quote unquote recipients, but who turn right around and volunteer with us also remotely, because maybe they don't feel comfortable leaving their house, but they can volunteer in the call center, or maybe they can, we had one of our recipients who's a philosophy teacher teach a Zoom lecture on the meaning of life, which is obviously very apropos given everything that we've been dealing with these last 2 years. So it's giving people a way to feel involved, to use their skills for a cause that they feel is worthy of their time, and making sure that you give them the respect of valuing their time as well. But it's difficult. The nonprofit sector, again, is not set up for sustainability. And so part of it is building those relationships and slowly scaling and making sure that your growth is controlled.
And so do you feel like, was there rapid growth in the beginning, and now based on the needs of the people you serve, that's sort of what percentage of the people you serve are paying for their own supplies, food, medicine, and what percentage now are you getting that working with other service organizations?
Yeah. It's fewer and fewer people paying for their own, and more people needing that pantry delivery. I don't know what the percentage is like in the last week or so, but it's changing.
It's changing. Okay.
And our mission is delivering essentials to those in need, and those in need changes. Right? We are not the same organization we were in March and April 2020, because it would be irresponsible to be that same organization, because the needs have changed. And that is one of the benefits of being a nimble, smaller grassroots organization, is people say, you know what, I actually don't need food, I need medicine. Or people can say, you know what, the USPS is being really ineffective at delivering ballots right now. And we said, great, we can deliver ballots. So we launched a ballot initiative to help get people's votes in, because the right to vote is absolutely essential. And so
was
that
the
kind
need.
of agility is one of the, I think, best things about the nonprofit sector. It may not be as scalable as government, but it's really able to respond in real time to people's needs. And that's what keeps it interesting and fun and exciting and important.
Okay, amazing. Now, Kristin, obviously this has been your own personal journey in grieving and recovering, healing, and doing amazing work and bringing people together. What's been the 2-year kind of arc of marked by COVID and kind of where you guys are now?
Yeah, I would agree that we're not exactly the same organization that we were a couple of years ago. And we really started off with really providing support to folks who are directly impacted, along with and severely impacted, in helping to develop them as leaders to tell their own stories and giving them the tools, the training, the media support, helping them recruit local volunteers to create their own sort of in-city networks that could work on local COVID issues. As our COVID response has changed and fluctuated, we've really developed kind of 3 priority areas in which we work in our programs. One is continuing to work with our families, but now it's more on a memorial project. And so we're actually working with a Yale alum, Sarah Sank, who is a amazing scholar of memory studies, who's helping us put together with artists in our community this vision for what does a democratized memorial look like, one that's bottom up, inside out, so that we don't capture just the stories we expect or that inertia knows we will capture about what this time was, but actually tell these stories in a way that gives a fuller picture of the full cost of the pandemic. So really protecting that legacy, not only so that we can honor those that we've lost, but that we can also codify the unvarnished truth of our lived experience in hopes that future generations do not repeat the same mistakes that were made, plus hold people who may be nefarious actors from today accountable. Programmatically, we're also working to establish a COVID Truth Commission and have legislation moving in that area to really look at and get the receipts of our response to better build back from this pandemic, and then continuing to push for working with communities all across the country to help them tell their pandemic story. So one thing I've been thinking about recently is just other folks within the Yale community and Yale network who've lost loved ones, who have long COVID, who have not been able, because we've all been in this survival mode, to actually take a step back and say, this was really hard. And this idea, this permission of us being able to mourn and grieve out loud, I think is incredibly powerful and necessary, not only for healing each of our individual pain and creating a collective memory of what happened, but also to build bridges across these divides we have ideologically within our country. I have seen Republicans, Democrats, people who have never been active before come together around grief, around loss, seeing each other as a person first, an American first, and then everything else next. And that's something I'm really excited about with our work. Is we are representing a constituency, a stakeholder group that has not yet been recognized by the major political parties, that I think has the potential to completely transform and play a very large role in upcoming elections.
Amazing. Amazing. Are you doing this full time, or are you still working environmental stuff on the side?
Yes. So I'm doing this work full time, as is my partner. This is part of the kind of like, what would I do? Lessons learned, sort of.
Go ahead.
Like,
Lessons, because that's the next question. Lessons learned. What would you do differently? If you could. I mean.
Yes. So if I could do everything all over again, I would shake my employer and have them really support, and my previous employer really support and incubate this organization, because literally this has been done sort of at our own personal risk and cost, and we've spent our savings to be able to sort of get us to where we're at today. And part of that was we needed to work in crisis mode. I knew we needed to come up with a business plan and a logic model and a 5-year sustainability plan, but I literally had thousands of people coming at me saying, my mother just died.
Yeah.
And I need help because no one else is helping me. Sort of like what Liam is saying. We have no policies for being able to deal with people who are bereaved and grieving and in loss. And so I think that like having the clarity of sort of time now behind me is thinking about going and really demanding that the support of people who wanted to support me be actually not charitable, but sustainable. And I think that one thing I've learned through lots of sort of peeking behind the curtains of other nonprofits is that most things that are kind of heart projects like this start as a project of X, Y, or Z company or nonprofit where you have somebody who can do the books, who can be able to help you set up your C3, C4. This, doing this all on your own without that support is not at all anything I would ever recommend to anybody, in particular, somebody not coming from and not having like intergenerational wealth to support.
Yeah. And so what's the organization kind of now? I mean, do you have employees? Do you've got other people, some staff? Do you have ongoing donors? What's your sort of sustainability look like? Yeah.
So right now we're organized as a C4. We're really excited because we're exploring launching our own C3, bringing on staff to be able to work on our memorial work long term. And, our
Can you tell the audience what a C4 is?
Yes. The difference between a C4 and a C3. So this is back to tax things and ways to legally organize yourself to be able to be in compliance with laws. A C3 basically is a service organization that doesn't do any sort of political work. So you can't say, I support X for Congress or I support Y bill. We decided to be a C4, which allows you to do lobbying work because we did not want to potentially prevent any of our families from sharing their truth. If they were wronged by a politician, if they were wronged by a policy, we wanted to be able to support them in calling that out and seeking accountability. Now, as we're working more, and C4 dollars are insanely hard to raise money for because they're not tax deductible. And it's just like, hand over fist, very difficult, running uphill in mud. But now that we're working on memorial stuff more kind of explicitly, we're able to launch a C3 arm, which will help us be able to raise more sustainable funding to bring on staff and support to really kind of see this through for the long haul. But currently our budget is almost 100% supported by small dollar donors. So people who are giving, like, I think our average contribution is flashback to Bernie Sanders 2016, it's $27. Obviously we have people who give $5,000 or $10,000, but it's a lot of folks from our community who are, given a small monthly gift to be able to keep the lights on and the Zoom subscription paid for. And
money to run it, these. Yeah,
exactly.
And just before we move back to Liam on his sort of lessons learned, and so there is a COVID now. This is the first COVID memorial, right? That you guys were behind.
So yeah, we have been incredibly active in this space. Worked with folks in New Jersey to help them establish a community COVID memorial, which is in Wall, New Jersey. And then we have worked to create a prototype for a national memorial that would be localized in places across the country. There was a great Forbes article last week about it that I suggest folks check out, that kind of unpackages, looks behind the wall of just how to create a memorial, which I had no idea 2 years ago, nor did I ever.
Newsweek, you said?
Forbes.
Forbes. Okay, we'll make sure we pull that article up. Okay, great. That's amazing. That's really, and thank you for sharing kind of the nitty gritty about, what kind of organizational form you formed for what purposes. Liam, you guys went through, became a 501c3, and thank goodness some lawyer was saying, you guys probably don't want all that cash sitting in someone's personal bank account, and probably not good to have Bernie Sanders sharing your personal phone number with, kind of what happened over and what would you have done differently, and kind of where are you guys now, and what are you thinking, for the future, or ways to keep the sustainability? You talked a little bit about that, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well,
I've
since changed my voicemail, outgoing message from Bess and Liam being like,
you should have Bernie Sanders voice on it.
Yeah, right, exactly. I think the biggest, I would classify the lessons into, three main lessons I've learned. Listen to experts, trust your gut, adapt and ask. Invisible Hands would not be what it is today. It would not exist if not for people who knew a lot more about the nonprofit sector than I did when I was getting started. I did not know what a fiscal sponsor was. If you're getting started and you're interested in creating your own nonprofit, learn about fiscal sponsorship first. It's a great way, you don't have to deal with the IRS. You can work as kind of as a program of an existing nonprofit, and they will route donations to you for a small fee. It's a great way, especially if you're just getting started or you're waiting on the IRS to get back to you about your C3 status. Things like that, I knew nothing about. And I had the opportunity to speak to nonprofit lawyers and accountants and fiscal sponsors to learn more about what that looked like. So the first is always listen to the experts. Second is trust your gut. Even as you're listening to the experts, if there's a need in your community that isn't being filled by the experts or by other people, try to fix that problem. I think that sometimes we as Yalies get so caught up in the idea of change the world that we lose sight of solve the problem, right? If you can solve a problem in your community, if you can fix a need, fill a need for someone, that's hugely powerful. That's super important. And trust your gut, on a human level, what do you think is the right thing to do when you're dealing with a problem? And that doesn't mean you should discard the opinions of others, but listen to your gut and what it's telling you, because your gut's a pretty good barometer probably. And then lastly is adapt and ask. I think we would not be what we are today if we weren't willing and ready and eager to change on a dime, because the pandemic was so tumultuous, right? There were times we thought the pandemic was closing and going to be over. There were times, a couple of weeks later when we thought, oh my God, it might be too dangerous to even go outside and dispatch volunteers at all. So you need to be ready to adapt and change quickly. And so we're constantly trying to build in mechanisms into our structure where we can shift them as needed to respond to emerging needs, like our food insecurity program, like our ballot delivery program, figuring out ways that we can use our model to solve problems in the community. And ask for support. It's one of the weirdest, hardest things to do at first, to ask for money from somebody else. I hated it. I still kind of hate it. It's worth it if you believe in your mission. And so make sure that you're asking people for financial support, for their time, for their expertise, to grab a coffee, to get a meeting, to hop on Zoom. And so in that vein, if you're interested in volunteering for Invisible Hands or donating, please go to invisiblehandsdeliver.org, shoot me an email, liam.elkind@yale.edu, still works for now. So shoot me an email. I'm sure Kristin will provide her info as well. But we need volunteers in this fight. Food insecurity is a huge problem. And we need everyone that we can get. We have remote volunteer opportunities available. If other people, we welcome people of all different talents and skill sets. To that adaptability point, we plug people in where they're needed and where they have the best expertise. If you're an engineer, lawyer, accountant, it doesn't matter. We'll find a way for you to use your expertise for good.
That's amazing. Are you still working just in the New York City area, or do you guys actually have some other groups of volunteers in other locations?
Yeah, we serve all 5 boroughs plus Westchester, Long Island, parts of Jersey, and Philadelphia.
Has anyone called you guys to say, can we run this model in San Francisco or something? Have you talked to other locations?
There's an Invisible Hands in Malta. That was weird. We started getting outreach from people in Malta because there's a chapter there. I mean, look, we certainly have gotten a lot of interest, just given difficulties finding volunteers and paying staff, in our own geographical region. It's hard, but long-term, certainly interested in continuing to scale our efforts as funding permits. So if you have $1 billion and want to donate it to help expand Invisible Hands, we will not say no.
Go ahead. We're nonprofits. We all need. Kristin, go ahead. Give us a plug for what Mark COVID is doing. What do you guys need to do what you do better?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what do we need to do to put you guys out of business? What do we need to do to keep you guys going and keep this work going?
I appreciate that. We are right now sort of organizing ourselves towards long-term stability. Part of that is we're bringing on new board members. We're especially looking for folks with expertise in policy, in other sort of practical skills, legal skills, that sort of thing. We are looking for volunteers to use your, superpower for COVID good, and sort of my Amazon wish list of things are like, if you have 2 hours to just, you're a lawyer and you can talk to us about a couple of questions that we have, that would be amazing. But also things like if you are a grant writer and can help us put in one of our 10 billion grants that we do every few months, like, let us know. I'll put you to work. And then, of course, connecting to your billionaire friends and others in the philanthropy world, getting past gatekeepers is really, really important. There's no doubt in my mind that Jeff Bezos or any other sort of bazillionaire would love the work that Mark by COVID is doing, or that Invisible Hands is doing, but it's also just a networking game. So part of what my sort of operation mode right now is taking the advice that Liam just gave, is talking to folks in my Yale network to see who we all know to make this happen. We are going to ensure that history actually accurately tells the story of the pandemic. You cannot get more Yale than that. So, Yalies,
that's
Kristin
beautiful.
and Mark by COVID.
Thank you. And we have this video, and all the resources and your links will go out to our network of over 9,000 people, and we're connected to the Yale network. And so hopefully this all helps everything. That's kind of what we do, is putting people together. I love that. I want to make sure you guys have seen a couple of the questions. I think we talked a little bit about competing. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, as nonprofits, yes, there's the common phrase, we're all competing for the same dollars. But do you feel like there are too many nonprofits in the space that you're in, or you're doing what you're doing because, do you feel like with pantries, are you encroaching on someone else's territory? Or have you found that it's like all hands on deck, everybody who's working on these issues, it's all needed? What do you think about that, Liam? And then COVID was one of the questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly going to be competition, on the grant side of things. But I don't know who I'm competing against for that money, so I don't feel competitive. And we try to be very intentionally collaborative to make sure that we aren't encroaching on other people's territory. It can get like that sometimes. People get territorial about the issues that they're working on. Particularly, I'm mindful that as a young guy and as a relative newcomer to this game, that I'm being deferential and respectful and asking how I can help support other people's needs. So pantries are doing a great job at providing food, but they also often have a lot of food that they aren't able to give out, or there's a lot of people that they aren't able to reach. And the lines at pantries go on for miles and miles,
I know.
And so we talked to these people about, how can we support you? Is there a way that we could help deliver some of this food to folks for you? So there's definitely competition in the delivery space, in the food space, in the volunteer space. We try to, support other nonprofits as much as we can, with the recognition that we're all in this together. Broadly, philosophically speaking, I do think consolidation of nonprofits is good. I think new organizations come into the fray, they have innovative ideas, and they should kind of be sucked up into bigger nonprofits to help make, to scale those efforts.
Scale it and be more proficient.
Yeah, innovation is great, but it needs scale. And so
Interesting.
I think there should be consolidation, but I also, I'm a big fan of innovation and certainly of collaboration always.
Boy, we could have a whole other discussion about that, about what do we do with innovation in the social impact sector, and where is it best to go, and how do you scale on that? Kristin, I mean, this is obviously the whole COVID related issue is relatively new. I don't know how many people there are or other nonprofits that are working in this space. I know early on, there were a lot of folks doing kind of pop-up PPE and mask supplies, and it was like all hands on that. Have you found other people kind of doing what you're doing in the space?
Is Kristin in the Zoom call?
Well, I had this on don't show by all right, maybe her audio will come back at least. Okay. I want to ask, why don't we just ask another question? Because you had brought this up, Liam, about this sort of you said you had someone give you a lecture on sort of philosophy of life, which I thought was great. You know, talk about people in your community. Someone asked a question about if you thought or done any other connections about kind of the other social, emotional, spiritual needs of the people that you serve, and what about the people that you know, work with you. We've done programs on managing your own staff when people have burnout, when they're dealing with very tough issues on the front lines, but maybe a little bit more mission creep. You can't be everything to everybody, but has that come up a little bit? Obviously, maybe just the sitting down and having the conversations with someone through the door. And do people feel like, do you ever have your volunteers who feel like they're underprepared to handle some of these situations where someone is desperately lonely or something? Or just, anyway, that was sort of an open question from the audience.
Yeah, and Ms. Akinola, I think you may have been my third grade teacher, at school at Columbia. Yes. Well, thank you.
I love it. That's beautiful.
Thank you for teaching me. It's good to see your name, if not your face. I hope we can catch up sometime after this. That's wild. I loved you, my teacher. You were amazing. In terms of your question, you know, the social emotional needs is definitely something that we focus on. You know, it impacts particularly people who are living by themselves, obviously, and particularly the elderly community. And so to the earlier point about collaboration, you know, we work with one group called Concerts in Motion that provides virtual concerts to elderly people or to people who are stuck at home. So we do mutual promotion of their events. You know, we make sure we're very mindful of the emotional hunger, as I said, of social isolation that can go often even deeper than that, you know, physical hunger for a lot of people who just need connection with another person. And it goes both ways. We have, I got a message recently from a volunteer. She's a mom, she volunteers with her son who has autism. And she said that it's been a game changer for him because he's able to make connections with people, and he enjoys adding up the prices of the different foods.
Oh, that's great.
It's been such a learning experience for him. So, you know, it's not just about invisible hands or a volunteer riding in on, you know, as a white knight to save the day. This is about forming connections in a community and about people helping each other out, because I fundamentally believe that we all have something to offer one another. We all have some things that we need from each other. And if we are able to come together in that mutual aid way as a community, to listen to each other's needs and to do what we can, you know, a little bit to help each other out. If we all do a little, no one has to do a lot.
That's a beautiful way to end this program. I'm sorry we lost Kristin. I think there's some technology, but I think we got a lot of your stories, your compassion, the energy that drives you guys to do this stuff. I hope you continue to get the support. I hope someday the issues that lead to needing you guys go away. But until then, we're very grateful that both you, Liam, and Kristin, and we're getting a lot of thank yous from the audience for sharing your story, for doing your work. I hope we can stay in touch and see where your lives go, and I hope we all cross paths again. So Kristin and Liam, thank you again. Thanks for coming. Thank you to our audience members for joining us. We will share this recording both in video and audio format. If you have any other resources related to any issues we've talked about this evening, and you want to share them with us, like the article in Forbes that Kristin, or anything along those lines, food insecurity, we're happy to share that and kind of pull that together as a list of resources for people to if they want to do deeper dives into these issues. So any last words, Liam? Otherwise,
I would say, you know, thank you to you know, we didn't get the chance to touch on what YANA has done, but it's worth learning more about for everyone out there. I mean, I said, you know, listen to experts. You guys have been super helpful ever since the beginning, willing to take meetings, help educate me about what the nonprofit sector looks like, hosting these forums. So I just want to say thank you for making a space.
It's very kind of you.
It's something that I wished when I had, you know, that I had done before starting Invisible Hands, that I had known what this looked like, because if I had had these opportunities to have these kinds of conversations and learn from people like you, Rachel, and Ken, I know that we would have been even stronger. So thank you.
You guys are very sweet. We're delighted to be in a position to be able to help. And we hope through these kind of connections and forums that the more people will learn and know to come to us. And we do know, and Liam, we may not send out your personal telephone number, but I'm sure in the future, you're going to be you're looked at as an expert now and part of this community. We're going to be bringing you back to talk about all that kind of stuff too. So best of luck, continued luck. And thank you again. Very sweet. Be well, everyone. And we'll see you at the next program. Good night.